Imagine spending $600 billion to prevent the end of civilization. Now, imagine discovering that maybe there was never any real danger. In 1999, the entire world prepared for the greatest technological catastrophe in history. Hospitals stocked up on medicine. The military went on high alert. Families bought water and food as if it were the apocalypse. All because of two digits. Two simple digits that could turn the year 2000 into 1,900 inches computers. But was the danger real, or was it the greatest bluff in modern history? Toronto, Canada, 1993. Peter de Jager, an apparently ordinary systems engineer, published an article that would change the course of an entire decade. Doomsday 2000. It wasn't science fiction. It was a technical warning that sounded like biblical prophecy. De Jager explained something few understood. In the 1960 seconds and 70 seconds, when computer memory cost a fortune, programmers saved space by representing years with only two digits. 1975 became 75. 1983 became 83. It seemed smart at the time, until someone asked, what happens when the year 2000 arrives? The problem was mathematical and terrifying. If the computer read 00 as 1900 instead of 2000, chaos would follow. Banking systems would calculate negative interest rates. Elevators could stop between floors. Nuclear plants could malfunction, and worst of all, military systems could interpret sensors as faulty and launch missiles by mistake. De Jager estimated it would take more than $50 billion to fix obsolete systems around the world. He had no idea he was underestimating the problem by more than 10 times. But here's the first mystery. De Jager wasn't the first to sound the alarm. In 1971, almost 3 decades earlier, Robert Beamer had already warned about exactly the same problem. No one listened. Why did the message finally resonate in 1993? Because the world was different. The internet was starting to connect everything. Computers were no longer isolated machines in labs. They controlled everything from traffic lights to national defense systems. Suddenly, those two digits had become a global time bomb. Washington, D.C., United States, 1996. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's words echoed through the halls of the U.S. Congress. The Millennium Bug may be the greatest national security threat since the Cold War. Hearings were held. Experts testified. And for the first time in history, Democrats and Republicans agreed on something. The entire country could grind to a halt at the turn of the century. 2 years later, Bill Clinton did something unprecedented. He created the President's Council on Year 2000 Conversion and appointed John Koskinen as the first Y2K czar in history. The mission was clear: coordinate all U.S. federal agencies in a race against time. The United States allocated $8.5 billion in government funds. American corporations spent at least $100 billion. But the most surprising thing was yet to come. Moscow, Russia, 1998. In the midst of the technological Cold War, something unthinkable happened. The United States and Russia, which had aimed nuclear missiles at each other for decades, sat at the same table to discuss computer digits. Together, they created the International Y2K Strategic Stability Center. The goal was terrifying in its simplicity: prevent faulty military date sensors from triggering an accidental nuclear war. Imagine it. After decades of tension, two countries that had nearly destroyed the world multiple times were now working together to stop computers from doing it for them. And it didn't stop there. In February 1999, the United Nations and the World Bank funded the International Y2K Cooperation Center. Headquarters, Washington. Mission: coordinate remediation programs in more than 170 countries. For the first time in history, practically every nation on Earth united around a common goal. It wasn't world peace. It was digital survival. But one question persisted behind the scenes. Was all this cooperation truly necessary, or were we building a solution for a problem that might not even exist? New York City, United States, 1998. In the mirrored offices of Manhattan, something extraordinary was happening. The Gartner Group, one of the largest tech consultancies in the world, released figures that kept CEOs awake at night. The global cost of making systems year 2000 compliant, would range between $300 and $600 billion. $600 billion? To put that into perspective, it was more money than the United States had spent on the Vietnam and Gulf Wars combined. Suddenly, IT consultants became humanity's heroes. Small tech companies turned into giants overnight. Million-dollar contracts were signed every week. Saving the digital world became an extremely profitable business. Peter de Jager, the man who sounded the initial alarm, watched it all with a mix of pride and concern. His warning had created an entire sector of the economy. In the end, expenditures reached nearly the $600 billion he had never imagined when he wrote his first article. Alan Greenspan, chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, publicly defended the investments. According to him, the private sector had spent $50 billion, and thanks to this preparation, the likelihood of systemic failure had become almost zero. But critics began to emerge. Some economists called the bug the bluff of the century. Others pointed out a suspicious coincidence. The same companies diagnosing the problem were the ones selling the solution. Mexico City, Mexico, 1999. The newspaper La Jornada published a devastating analysis. It compared the cost of fixing the bug to the greatest wars in modern history and called it one of the worst losses in economic history. The article pointed out something ironic. The root cause of the entire crisis was the date abbreviations used to save expensive memory in earlier decades. Decades later, the world was spending fortunes to undo a savings of just a few bytes. But were we paying to fix a real problem or funding the greatest marketing scheme in the history of technology? Sydney, Australia, the 31st of December, 1999, 11:59 p.m. The world was watching. TV cameras zoomed in on the famous fireworks of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Not for beauty, but out of fear. If something went wrong, Australia would be the first to know they were several hours ahead of the rest of the world. Australian technicians were literally the sentinels of digital humanity. At local midnight, a sigh of relief echoed across the planet. Sydney was still working. The lights stayed on. The fireworks exploded on time. The first test had passed. Moscow, Russia, a few hours later. In Russian military bunkers, generals watched computer screens with the tension of a nuclear crisis. Missile systems were monitored second by second. Radars stayed on high alert. The cooperation with the Americans was being tested in practice. Any strange signal would be immediately shared to avoid misinterpretation. When the clock struck 000 inches Moscow, no missile launched by mistake. No defense system panicked. Another test passed. London, United Kingdom, minutes before midnight. In British command centers, thousands of bugbusters awaited the moment of truth. 6 months of intensive work would be validated in the next few seconds. Hospitals, banks, power grids, all monitored simultaneously. At London's midnight, problems did occur. 20,000 credit card terminals failed. It wasn't the end of the world, but it confirmed the bug was real, at least partially. New York City, United States, the 31st of December 1999, 11:50 p.m. Times Square was packed with millions of people, but in the surrounding buildings, technicians faced the real drama. Wall Street had backup systems running in parallel. Airports had canceled flights as a precaution. John Koskinen, the Y2K czar, was at a federal command center coordinating agencies across the country. When Times Square's giant clock struck midnight, something magical happened, almost nothing. Some systems failed here and there, but no systemic collapse, no digital apocalypse. The $100 billion invested by the American private sector seemed to have worked, but minor glitches confirmed the threat wasn't entirely imaginary. A 105-year-old man in Minnesota was invited to attend kindergarten because the system miscalculated his age. Babies were recorded as being born in 1900. The U.S. Naval Observatory's webpage displayed 1 January 19100. Real problems but far from the announced catastrophe. Princeton, United States, 2005. The Princeton Public Library published a devastating retrospective analysis. The Y2K effort was so effective that today many consider the bug a myth. It was the ultimate paradox. The absolute success of prevention created the narrative that there had never been any real danger. The library compared the phenomenon to vaccines. When they work perfectly, people forget why they were created. But the legacies of Y2K went far beyond technology. Popular culture absorbed the bug into movies, music, and comedic narratives. Surreal stories circulated. A man received a bill for $91,250 for renting a movie for 100 years. The system had calculated the fine using the year 1900. Survivalism had a revival that still influences prepper movements today. The fear of technological collapse planted seeds that later grew into modern conspiracy theories. In the corporate world, Y2K pushed companies to organize software inventories for the first time in history. Redundant systems were consolidated. Contingency plans were developed. The experience showed that regular testing of legacy systems was essential, a lesson that would prove crucial in facing future threats, such as cyber attacks and artificial intelligence failures. The geopolitical aspect also left its mark. U.S.-Russia cooperation to prevent accidental missile launches created precedents for cybersecurity collaborations. The UN's global coordination established protocols that would later be reused in future crises. For the first time, the world had united to face a purely technological threat, and it worked. But the fundamental question remained unanswered. Was Y2K the greatest bluff in history or humanity's most expensive and successful act of prevention?